Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today for this month's Place of Climate Change seminar. Today I want to introduce you to Dr. Charlie Gardner, who is a conservationist, a climate communicator and activist, an associate lecturer at the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent. His work focuses on the role of academic activism in the climate movement and adapting the conversation sector to the emerging realities of the climate crisis. Charlie's talk today on what to conserve in a rapidly heating world will bring nature, climate change and geography together to explore how we adapt to our changing world. Over to you, Charlie.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Karina. Could you just, can you see my slides?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for this invitation, and thanks for coming, everybody. I've been a conservationist all my life. All I've ever wanted to do since I was a young child was help conserve the living world. But since I started lecturing at the University of Kent 10 years ago and started teaching on a course on climate change, I have shifted my focus from conserving biodiversity to addressing the climate crisis, and I've shifted my approaches from research and teaching to communications and political activism. What I'd like to speak to you about today is sort of the intersection of those two worlds. It's about what the climate crisis means for our notions of conserving biodiversity. And I'd like to use the thought experiment of what our future ecosystems will be like here in the British Isles to discuss what the new realities of climate change mean for us, not just as conservationists and people interested in biodiversity, but people interested in landscape and place. So conservation is conservation science is an interdisciplinary field of research. It differs from many fields of research in that it is explicitly value-driven and goal-oriented. It was, in its early days in the 80s, it was described as a crisis discipline. We do our research with the purpose of conserving biodiversity. And because of that, it's hugely varied. A review in Oryx 10 years ago said there are huge disagreements about what conservation is. And this is a really important question because it's not just academic. Our conceptions of biodiversity and what we hope to do with it have real world implications in terms of our objectives, our strategies, the actions we implement.
Charlie, could you swap your viewpoint on the PowerPoints to that's it, I think. Yeah.
Sorry, did it not shift slide?
I think it was doing it in a different format, wasn't it, Sophie?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Charlie. No, I do apologise. They were in presenter mode, I think, so we could see the slide small, but then your notes page large. And I don't know whether you can switch the view so that we can see your slides.
I think that's it. If you just do it from current slide now.
Can I just leave it like this? Will that be all right?
Yeah, unless you just go to slideshow from beginning and get onto the one you.
No, it's back
no, doesn't
now,
it?
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's display settings, possibly, but that's okay if that's easier. I can read that now, so that's okay. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I didn't want to miss it.
No, it's important that you did. There's no point doing a talk that you can't see. I might just continue rather than messing about. Sorry.
Yeah.
So one thing all these different sort of conceptions of conservation all do seem to share is this idea that we're trying to conserve biodiversity, and there's a lot hidden in these two words. So the word conserve, that's all about conserving. It's right there in the word. It's about retaining what we have, keeping what we have, or in the subfield of restoration ecology, it's about reversing the change to get to some desired past state. So conservation is all about preventing or reversing change, keeping things as they are. And we want to keep things as they are or how they were. So we look to the past as our baseline. Because we're focused on conserving biodiversity, we tend to focus on, or we have historically focused on, diversity itself. And of course, diversity is only one quality or characteristics of ecosystems. We could prioritize for ecosystem function or ecosystem services or bioabundance. Sorry, could someone, could Heather please mute themselves, please?
Yeah, sorry, take it. Thank you.
But we don't. We focus on diversity, and that means our broad goal has always been about preventing extinctions of species. And that means we tend to focus on the rarer species, the most threatened species. But one thing about the rarest and most threatened species is that they're the least important functionally. They don't contribute to ecosystem function because there's only a few of them in a few tiny places. They're not like the common species, which contribute a lot to ecosystem function. And conservation is explicitly place-based. Apart from the very small amount of ex situ conservation, like, you know, captive breeding in zoological gardens and seed banks, almost all conservation is explicitly place-based, and that's for a number of reasons. So our main conservation strategy is establishing protected areas, parks and reserves. This is a map of global protected areas on land and sea. They cover 15% of the Earth's land surface. It's also the case that, you know, as with everything, our governance of biodiversity is arranged at domestic levels, at national levels. So authority for biodiversity, conservation policy, conservation funding are all arranged at national levels. So we have a necessarily parochial view of things. Conservation authorities in the UK are responsible for biodiversity in the UK, not global biodiversity. We've long had a focus on conceptions of native and non-native species because one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss has been the introduction of invasive non-native species. And this is, in particular, this has been a huge driver of extinctions because many of the modern extinctions we've suffered have been on islands, which are, you know, depauperate ecosystems that often don't have mammalian predators on. So when you introduce mongooses, rats and cats, species of bird and reptile go extinct. So this idea of non-native species is a huge bogeyman in conservation. We're very, very wary of it. The other thing I think is a huge but unrecognized driver of the place-based nature of conservation is a sense of attachment. We are attached to the landscapes and the species that we love. I, this morning, felt huge joy walking out into my garden and hearing chiffchaffs and blackcaps singing. I am attached, not just, so it's not just that, you know, for all the other reasons that I love biodiversity, I love the biodiversity where I live. And that's not random. It's the place, it's the species and landscapes I'm used to. So conservation is explicitly place-based and it's explicitly backwards looking. We try to prevent change and conserve what we have. That's always sort of been okay, but it's not anymore because the planet is rapidly heating and change is inevitable as a result. So trying to prevent change, trying to keep things as they are, it's a hugely maladaptive strategy. And yet conservation remains fixed on its objective of conserving. And I really, really think that this has to change rapidly. So why is everything changing? So as temperatures, as conditions change locally, so of course every species is exquisitely adapted to the specific set of conditions that occur where it is now. As those conditions change, it can respond in one of three ways. It can change itself, it can adapt its physiology, but there's not a lot of examples of this because it's happening so fast now. They can change in time. They can change their phenology. And of course, we've all noticed this every spring. Now's a classic time to notice this. Species are starting to blossom earlier and earlier. Birds are breeding earlier and earlier. Insects are emerging earlier and earlier. And spring is, 10, 15 days earlier in the UK than it was when the cleric Robert Marsham first started noting the first signs of spring in Norfolk, near where I live, in the 1700s. But the main way that species respond to changing conditions where they live is to change where they live. They change in space rather than time. They shift their ranges. And of course, this has always happened. So these two images on the left, the top one shows Northern Europe 24,000 years before the present. And there's Britain on the left. It's a bit of a funny angle, but there's Britain on the left there. And as you can see, there are three major ice sheets covering Northern Europe. The ice sheets came down as far as the Midlands in the UK. The other thing you can see in that picture is that the British Isles are connected to the European mainland via a land bridge. By 9,000 years ago, those glaciers had receded. So, of course, every species that's in the British Isles now got there by expanding northwards as the tundra retreated. Every species got there. So clearly species are able to shift their ranges in response to climate change. The other key thing that these things show is that we have this essentially arbitrary cutoff point 9,000 years ago for, of course, flying insects and birds carried on colonizing, but for terrestrial species and those with poor dispersal ability, if they managed to track the retreating tundra and reach what became the British Isles before 9,000 years ago, then they were established before the land bridge was severed, and they are native species. If they didn't quite reach there in time, then they haven't subsequently, unless they've been introduced, and they are non-native species. But when we think of geological time scales or things, 9,000 years is no time at all. And in many respects, the concept of native species to Britain is a cultural one, not an ecological one. Because species which have, subsequently expanded to the coast of France or the Netherlands are not ecologically any different to the ones that reached here before the land bridge was severed. They were part of the same ecological communities. They just didn't quite reach here in time. So range expansion happens through a complex set of processes. You can imagine an idealized species distribution in France here. What's happening is that individuals are colonizing at the leading edge, the northwards edge of the range expansion, and local populations are slowly going extinct or failing to breed so successfully, so they go extinct at the trailing edge. And this is happening now. It happened in response to the Ice Age 10,000 years ago. It's happening again now in response to current climate change. So this is a paper in Nature, Ecology and Evolution last year. Headline finding: the forests of Europe are undergoing a profound reorganization. And we're suffering massive tree mortality across Europe, huge spikes in tree mortality that are, have been unusual historically. So it's climate-driven rain shifts are currently a massive issue affecting Europe's biodiversity. We don't know exactly, we don't have precise understanding of what ecological conditions will be like in the UK in future, but a study looking at using a technique of finding analogues between different cities, climate analogues, found that the closest we can get to imagining the what the climate of London will be like in 2050 is what the climate of Barcelona is like now. And London and Barcelona have hugely different conditions. The plants and animals that make up the forests of southern Britain are not adapted to Mediterranean conditions. They are simply not adapted to it. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what future can we imagine for Britain's forests, and what does that mean for how we manage our landscapes? So species, patterns of shifts are complex and depend on local conditions, but in general, species are moving polewards. For those that can't fly, or that, so plants with large seeds or animal dispersed seeds, non-flying mammals, all reptiles and amphibians, non-flying invertebrates, the freshwater communities, the plant and animal communities of leaf litter and soil, will not be able to disperse across the channel. Yes, transoceanic rafting happens occasionally on geological timescales, but not on a practical timescale. So what we will see in the future is that as communities shift northwards, many of those with poor dispersal won't make it into the UK. As a result, any ecological community on Great Britain will have a depauperate and species it'll have a much smaller community of plants and animals than an equivalent piece of land at the equivalent latitude in the Netherlands or Germany. And as a result, those forests will be less resilient, they'll be less rich, they'll be less capable of generating the ecosystem services that we rely on them for. They'll be less good at conserving biodiversity, they'll be less good at preventing flooding, they will be less good at providing cultural ecosystem services. They won't be as beautiful, they won't sound as nice because they won't be as full of birds, So this isn't just about conserving biodiversity. Forests are more than just homes for other species. They are important parts of our landscapes. They generate services for us. And yet, unless we actively do something, our forests in the UK will be more species poor and less resilient than they could be. So for a long time, conservationists have been talking about this strategy called assisted colonization. The first reference I can find to it was in this paper from 1985 called The Greenhouse Effect and Nature Reserves. It says, if conditions continue to change, individuals of disappearing species may have to be transferred to new reserves. For example, warmth-adapted ecotypes may have to be transplanted to the poles. There was then no further mention of assisted colonization in the literature until 2004, when Connie Barlow and Paul Martin in the US wrote a piece, not in the peer-reviewed literature, but in a conservation magazine, arguing for a conservation strategy for one plant species, Torreya taxifolia, which is a relic species of conifer that was found in Florida and dying out because it's cold adapted and Florida is hot. So they were saying we need to bring it north. And they were doing it. They belonged to a group called the Torreya Guardians, and they were doing it. They had a landowner in Georgia who would accept Torreya seedlings, and so they did it. And they said assisted migration frightens for precisely the same reason it fascinates. Anybody can do it, for good or ill, and with care or abandon. And I think this idea sort of frightened the conservation community, and there was, for a few years, there was lots of talk in the literature about this idea, and lots of it was negative, primarily because conservation has such a long history with struggling against invasive species. Species being introduced to a new landmass has been a huge problem for conservation. So the idea of deliberately doing this, it just flies in the face of convention. There was a massive backlash against the idea, culminating perhaps in this paper in Trends in Ecology and Evolution in 2019 that said, even if preceded by careful risk assessment, such action is likely to produce myriad unintended and unpredictable consequences. They concluded it is not a viable conservation strategy. What's important about all this work is they all talk about assisted colonization as a method for conserving species that are threatened by climate change, like the Torreya taxifolia. If conditions are not going to be suitable for you where you are now, and your species has nowhere else to go, then we should take it somewhere else where it should be, where it might have a chance of surviving. And there's always been this idea that assisted colonization is just for the purpose of rescuing threatened species. So there was a big decision framework published in the journal Science in 2008. And the very first question in the decision framework is your species threatened by climate change? The academic Chris Thomas suggested in 2011, actually, that the UK might play host to translocations of Iberian species which live in Spain and Portugal but have no future there because of climate change. And he suggested that the Pyrenean desman, which is a small aquatic mammal, the Iberian lynx, and the butterfly, the Provence chalkhill blue, be translocated to the UK. Importantly, this is for the purpose of conserving those species. The UK itself, as the recipient landmass, doesn't necessarily receive any benefit from receiving these species. It's all about conserving these threatened species. Under that criterion, there would be no reason to conserve common Southern European, there'd be no reason to translocate common Southern European tree species to Britain because they're common and widespread and they can just move further north elsewhere on mainland Europe. They don't need to colonize the British Isles to be able to survive. What I argue is that this isn't about conserving common Southern European trees. It's about having forests in Britain. And if we want forests in Britain, we're going to have to bring Southern European trees here. So it's not about doing it for the benefit of the translocated species. It's about doing it for the benefit of the recipient ecosystem. And this is an idea that seems to be completely absent, apart from one paper published in Biological Conservation 12 years ago. And they highlighted the different reasons why we might want to do assisted colonization. Not just to help threatened species, but to help the ecosystems that are losing their species. So there was lots of research about assisted colonization, and I don't know how well you can see this diagram, this bibliometric analysis on the right, but the colors here show three big literatures on assisted colonization. In blue, the small one at the top is ecology. On the left in green is conservation biology, and on the right is forestry. So research in assisted colonization, it peaked in 2015, and there's not really been much since. And since then, the only research has been in forestry, not conservation. I think this is a damning indictment of academic research and its pursuit of novelty, because assisted colonization is more relevant than it's ever been. But because the discussion was had 10 years ago, it's not being had now. And it's a real problem. Yeah, I couldn't get this work published because it wasn't novel. It's the other thing this bibliometric analysis shows is there's no research on the use of assisted colonization to help our ecosystems adapt rather than just to conserve threatened species. So it's the whole idea has disappeared from the conservation science literature, and nor is it in policy. So here are four big policy documents, two from the British Ecological Society, one of which is a 25-year scan of future ecological research topics for the British Isles. And it doesn't mention the idea of assisted colonization. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is the nature version of the IPCC, doesn't mention it. The Convention on Biological Diversity, the Global Biodiversity Framework signed in 2022, does not mention it. So this very, very straightforward and I think very common sense idea simply is not part of the discussion, even at a time of rapid climate change, which is accelerating. I find it just extraordinary. And of course, so my co-author and I, we used this thought experiment of the British Isles because it's a very easy system to conceptualize. It's an island. But if we accept that we might have to carry out assisted colonization to overcome geographical barriers, then what about anthropogenic barriers? Because yes, it is true that species have always shifted their ranges in response to climate change in the past, but that was in an ecologically intact world, and the world is not intact now. It is highly, highly fragmented. And, if you're a species of whatever, springtail in the soil or something, then one field of oilseed rape between two patches of forest might be an insurmountable barrier. How do we facilitate range shifts for species in such a fragmented world? And this is the conversation I just think we need to rekindle. We might have had this conversation 10 years ago, but it really needs to be part of the current conservation discussion now, not least because, as my colleague James and I argue, if this is going to become apparent that if this is necessary, then we need to develop policy and legislative frameworks and regulatory bodies to manage it. We can't just leave it to the Connie Barlows and Torreya Guardians to decide which species to shift on their own, I don't think. To paraphrase the proverb, the best time to plan and facilitate the establishment of the climate resilient ecosystems of tomorrow was 30 years ago, but the next best time is now, and we're still not having that discussion. This idea is part of a whole suite of ideas that James and I are developing, trying to bring about a paradigm shift from conservation, trying to conserve what was and prevent it changing, to survival ecology, which is a paradigm that recognizes the impact of climate on threats to human survival, and says we need to become much more proactive rather than reactive. Stop trying to pretend change isn't happening, and starts to actively reshape ecosystems to maximize the possibility of ecosystem function and ecological processes, and to maximize the chances of ecosystem persistence, because such is the severity of climate change that it really is going to need that. I've talked all about what happens at the southern edge of Britain, which is the leading edge of range shifts. I've been talking about the leading edge of populations moving northwards, but what about the trailing edge of our northern populations in Scotland, like the Capercaillie? So the Capercaillie is a huge conservation flagship in the Scottish Highlands, and it's very culturally and economically salient. There's a lot of Capercaillie photos in all the hotels up in the Highlands. It attracts people to the region. It's part of the sense of place and the Scottish Highlands sense of place. As a result, we invest hugely in it. So this is a 3-year-old headline from The Guardian: emergency plan to save Capercaillie bird launched as numbers plummet. We are throwing money at this bird to try to prevent its disappearance in Scotland. But when we model what climate change is going to do to it, 99% of its suitable range will disappear at 1.9 degree of heating, and we're already at 1.6 degrees of heating. So this is a species that has zero long-term future in Scotland, and we are throwing money at it. We are prioritizing it over species moving up from the south, which might have a future in Scotland. And that doesn't even make sense in terms of global biodiversity conservation, because this picture at the bottom here shows the global range of the Capercaillie. We are a peripheral edge population in Scotland. If the Capercaillie is going to survive climate change, it will do so in Siberia and Scandinavia, and Scottish populations will have zero contribution to that. So even before climate change was an issue, this was an interesting discussion for conservationists, and whether our sense of place and attachment to place makes us unnecessarily parochial when it comes to global conservation priorities. Maybe that's a question to discuss. Anyway, if there are species which have no future, shouldn't we be carrying out triage? So battlefield triage is a horrific concept, but you've got hundreds of wounded medics wounded soldiers, and you've got 3 medics trying to treat them. They have to carry out triage. Everyone who's not going to survive their wounds, don't treat them. Everyone who is going to survive their wounds, don't treat them, no matter how much pain they are in. But those who will only survive if their wounds are treated, that's what you've got to focus on, because you don't have the resources. Triage is a horrific concept, but we really do need to start doing it when it comes to conservation, because we don't have the resources. So if we're going to be more I don't know. I just think, triage is unavailable, so it is unavoidable. So we need to be more thoughtful about what we value. What are we trying to conserve? Because we can't conserve everything, and there's some important things that stem from that, I think. Oops, that's a horrible typo. Sorry, but it's not just conservation. All of human endeavor essentially looks to the past. Farmers make their decisions based on what things used to be like in the past. We prioritize investment on infrastructure based on what conditions used to be like in the past. It's just an innate thing that's deeply built into our thinking, because the past is all we know. Of course, it dominates our thinking. But the future will not be like the past, so we have to change that. Assisted colonization isn't the answer, and in fact, I can well see why everyone's so against it. It will be complex and messy and expensive and difficult, and there will be unintended consequences. But keeping things as they are is simply not an option. It's not on the cards. We have two choices between chaotic transformative change and between somewhat planned and facilitated transformative change. And I don't know, I just think it's a no-brainer, really. Looking beyond nature and migration of other species, everything I've said applies to other things too, I think. It's not just plants and animals, other plants and animals that have an ecological niche. Humans have an ecological niche, but human activity has an ecological niche. Growing crop X can only happen in certain conditions. And our infrastructure has a niche as well. You can't have homes under the sea, to put it simply. I think we have a lot of thinking ahead, and I will leave it there. I've realised I've not left a huge amount of time for questions. If you do have further thoughts, do please feel free to get in touch afterwards. You can find me all over social media. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. That was really interesting, and I think it's sort of very pertinent to this group and our focus, and having a look at sort of the changing understanding and sort of relationship we have with place and identity and change, and that sort of rapid change, and our relationship to how to conserve and react to that. Because so very, very interesting seminar indeed. Right, open to the floor then. Anybody fancy asking Charlie a question? Yeah,
I'm quite happy to ask the question. If the Charlie is happy to that. Charlie, it was very nice to listen to you, and especially your interest or your topics is really nice, and my current research involved. I want to get your view about last week Thursday. EU Commission has been postponed non-financial disclosure, which is environmental disclosure directives. How you see this postponing about 2 years? What is your view on that?
I'm sorry, I don't have specific knowledge of that, so I can't really comment. If you have a thought that you think is relevant to me, I'd love to hear it.
I mean, I am working on the point as area. It's for me. It's just a semi-disaster for what the UN gained over the time, and then just which EU is one of the continent which is very advocating to environmental issues and climate change, and somehow this postponed. Basically, for me, rough to say, or it's just do what how much you can pollute, and that doesn't matter. This could be even further impact and negative impact on the biodiversity, life, other creatures that except from human. That's
absolutely.
I was so close about this postponing.
So this is it's consistent with trends across Europe, in the UK now, in the US. For me, it's yeah, it's the victory of corporate lobbying and private interests in policy making over evidence and social interests in policy making. And yes, it's a continuation of these decades long trends. Corinna, are you facilitating, or shall I nominate?
You can. Jake's got the next question
Anyway,
now,
Jake.
but yeah. Oh, you're still on mute, Jake.
It was the hand button, not the mute button. I'm a biodiversity assistant and a wildlife forest gardener in West Wales, and I had a very interesting project over in West Wales, talking to the senior ecologist about a county farm and a potential project for planting up non-native species like agroforestry species. And the county ecologist was I was quite surprised about how rigid they were with the species that they would allow and wouldn't allow, and had a graduated a list of species that, you know, these are the native to Pembrokeshire, these are native to West Wales, these are native to Wales, and they're kind of expanding like that. But I kind of really feel there's this idea that that there isn't the sense of urgency, and there isn't the knowledge that ecologists don't seem to have and don't seem to appreciate the changing climate. So my question, Charlie, is, are there resources, or is there some additional resources to be able to access, to be able to say, this is what's happening and these are the predicted changes in ecosystems across the country? Are there any kind of resources like that, or any groups like that where such information could be accessed?
Disappointingly little, really disappointingly little. So there's the odd report. So for example, you know, my Kappa Cayley slide there, that referred to a report on climate change impacts on biodiversity in Scotland. But yeah, it's dispersed, and it's not, it's not widely available, and more importantly, it's not listened to. So you know, there was that report by Scottish Environment Link that said explicitly 99% of Kappa Cayley habitat is going to be gone by 2050 in Scotland. 3 years after that report, there was a decision to invest hugely in Kappa Cayley conservation. I think your point about a certain climate blindness in amongst conservationists is a really valid one. I've noticed it in so many respects. I think it's largely a psychological phenomenon, and there's a few things that contribute to it. One is, I don't know, I think it's partly that we have our hands so full with the biodiversity crisis, and we have our minds so full already with existing threats to biodiversity, that this whole to think that there's a whole new thing to consider is really difficult. On top of that, it's really challenging, because it does challenge some of our core concepts and values. You know, it's a the idea of triage, the very idea of deciding not to conserve the Kappa Cayley in Scotland is horrific. So it's just much easier just to not think about it at all. But and yeah, it's a real issue, which is why I've left the conservation sector to focus on climate activism, really. But the one thing I still do is I try to write about stuff that just try to shake conservation a bit into trying to recognize these emerging realities, because if we don't, we really will be in a whole heap of trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jake. And anecdotally, as somebody who just loves gardening and is not a gardener and is not in the environmental sciences, I'm a social scientist, I noticed that Gardner's World actually addresses it almost every single episode, that there was like, how do we adapt to climate change, what plants to use where, and there's lots of gardens that are doing that experimentation work. I don't know whether it then links into the academic sort of studies that might be happening in sort of, you know, a neighbouring field, but that sort of on the TV visible to me, that sort of conversation and trial is going on.
Well, I'm so glad you said that, because I didn't. But this is the extraordinary thing, is that conservationists are the only ones not having this conversation, because we're the only ones that have these deeply held values about native species and these deeply held concerns about non-native species. But agriculture, forestry, horticulture, all of them, without a moment's hesitation, are bringing in new species and varieties that are adapted to emerging conditions. Why on earth would we allow natural ecosystems to be the only components of our landscape where we don't facilitate this adaptation? Just because we have this idea of, no, that's a natural ecosystem, so we shouldn't interfere. Yes, it would be lovely to just not interfere and just leave it be. But if we just leave it be, we will have no forests. So the question isn't, you know, is that native or not? The question is, do we want trees in southern Britain in the future? And yeah, it's obvious, isn't it?
And are there any resources for those as well, like particular species and species interactions? Is there any body of work on that area?
Interactions is really, really difficult. I can send. There's a bit of a literature on trees and trees on the move in the UK. There's been 3 or 4 recent stories. So if I could ask you to forward those, if I send them to you, Karina, that would be brilliant, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll get your. If you type your email in there, Jake, I can forward them on to you.
Oh, sorry, I assumed you'd already have it. I could just do that myself directly, but
No,
I'll send them to you in
Jake's
case others are
external,
interested.
so I can't just sort of search for him. But that's fine. Right, anybody else got any other questions?
Debbie.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Just thank you. This is really interesting, and I think the point you raise is I hadn't heard about it before, about helping species to move. But just thinking it through, isn't there a risk, a really high risk, of introducing non-native? I use the word non-native without judgment, but non-native species into Britain if things don't transpire to be as bad at 2050 as predicted by the models, because it's making the assumption that what people are trying to do, for example, like peatland restoration and planting seagrass and sea kelp, isn't, and even on the global scale, isn't going to slow things down and help. So that's the question, please. The risk element. Thank you.
So there's a couple of different elements to that in terms of risk. So when we look at the dangers of invasive species, the most invasive, the ones that cause the biggest ecological and economic damage, tends to be from different continents. Not so, it's obviously it's a bit silly to think of native and non-native as a binary. There's a gradation. We're not talking about bringing in things from Australia. We're talking about bringing in things from mainland Europe. So the risk is lower. In terms of the possibility of things being not as bad as they would be, I recognize that there is lots of work, as you say, on restoring natural carbon sinks and investing in natural climate solutions. They will not be enough unless we address fossil fuels, because climate change is driven by fossil fuels. Ecosystems only absorb 25% of our emissions. There is no sign of of decline in use of fossil fuels. It's growing year on year. It's not that we don't have our foot hard enough on the brake, it's that the foot is on the accelerator. So my main thrust of what I do is being a climate activist to try and stop fossil fuels and the use of fossil fuels, because no amount of conservation will be able to conserve biodiversity unless we transition away from fossil fuels as fast as we can. So that's mainly what I do. In the meantime, I think we have to prepare for changes that are coming. Mitigation is not enough. We have to adapt. And I don't know, in conservation, we adopt we try to adopt a precautionary approach. We try to think of the bad stuff that will happen and adapt to that, rather than hoping that it won't happen. And every indicator of climate change is, we have been far too conservative in all our predictions. It's happening much faster than we'd always thought it would do. So I think being prepared for what's coming is a wise bet.
And on that wise note, thank you very much, Charlie. That was an extremely interesting and thought-provoking seminar. And yes, I think lots of things for us to think about and reappraise, and I know it expands wider to other sort of areas of focus, I think, really, because I think that's one of the things we've got to grapple with, is the fact that we're going to have to change and not just stop. We can't stop everything, even if we slow it down. So very thought-provoking and very interesting. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much for joining.
Cheers.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
See you later. Bye.